In the sun-scorched sands of Petra, a tyrannical matriarch, Mrs. Boynton, rules her family with an iron grip, her wealth a chain binding their dreams. When she's found dead, a tiny puncture mark whispers murder. Enter Hercule Poirot, the brilliant detective whose little grey cells unravel a web of secrets, resentment, and betrayal. As the rose-red cliffs loom, every glance hides a motive, and every shadow conceals a killer. Will Poirot uncover the truth before it's buried in the desert forever? Chapter 1. The shadow of control. The sun blazed over Jerusalem, its golden rays glinting off the ancient stones of the old city. Hercule Poirot, the diminutive Belgian detective with a moustache as precise as his mind, sat at a corner table of a small cafe near the Jaffa Gate. He had come to the Holy Land seeking respite from the clamour of cases, but his sharp eyes, ever alert, betrayed no hint of repose. The air was thick with the scent of cardamom and the hum of voices. Pilgrims, traders, and tourists weaving through the narrow streets. Poirot sipped his tisane, savouring its warmth, and allowed his gaze to wander, for it was in such moments of quiet observation that the little grey cells began their dance at a nearby table. A family caught his attention, not for their harmony but for the palpable tension that hung over them like a storm cloud. At its centre sat a woman of imposing presence, her bulk dominating the wrought iron chair. Mrs. Boynton, as Poirot later learned her name, was a figure of formidable authority. Her face, broad and sallow, bore the weight of years and an unyielding will. Her eyes, small and glittering like those of a serpent, surveyed her companions with a cold, predatory intensity. Around her sat her grown children, 3 sons and a daughter, each tethered to her by an invisible chain. Their faces, though varied in expression, shared a common thread of unease, as if they were actors in a play they dared not leave. The eldest, Lennox Boynton, slouched in his chair, his gaunt features etched with resignation. His wife, Nadine, a strikingly handsome woman with auburn hair, sat beside him, her fingers nervously twisting a napkin. Raymond, the second son, had a sensitive face, almost boyish, but his eyes flickered with a suppressed fire. Carol, his sister, shared his dark hair and fine bones, but her posture was rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. The youngest, Ginevra, was a study in contrast, her delicate beauty marred by a vacant stare, as if she inhabited a world apart. Beside them, a man Poirot took to be an outsider to the family later, identified as Jefferson Cope, Mrs. Boynton's stepson, sat with a forced smile, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Poirot's attention sharpened as a fragment of conversation reached him, carried on the warm breeze. Raymond leaned toward Carol, his voice low but urgent. "She's got to go, Carol. We can't live like this forever." His words were cut short by Mrs. Boynton's gaze, which snapped to him with the precision of a whip. "Raymond," she said, her voice low and venomous, "mind your tongue." The young man flinched, his defiance crumbling, and silence fell over the table like a shroud. Jefferson Cope offered a nervous laugh, murmuring something about the heat, but Mrs. Boynton's eyes never left Raymond, pinning him in place. Poirot adjusted his straw hat, his mind alight with curiosity. Mon Dieu, he thought, what a tableau of misery. The family dynamic was not merely strained, it was suffocating, as if Mrs. Boynton held their very breaths in her grasp. He noted the way Lennox avoided his mother's gaze, the way Nadine's hand hovered protectively near her husband, and the way Ginevra's fingers plucked at her sleeve, lost in some private torment. Jefferson Cope, though, intrigued him most. His deference to Mrs. Boynton seemed practiced, yet his eyes held a glint of something darker resentment, perhaps, or calculation. As the waiter refilled his cup, Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of another figure at the café. A young woman, her dark hair neatly pinned and her manner brisk, approached the Boynton table. She introduced herself as Sarah King, a doctor on holiday, and addressed Raymond with a warmth that seemed to startle him. "I couldn't help but overhear your plans for Petra," she said, her voice bright but careful. "It's a marvelous place. You'll love it." Mrs. Boynton's head turned slowly, her gaze appraising Sarah with the cold scrutiny of a jeweler examining a flawed stone. "We keep to ourselves, Miss King," she said, her tone final. Sarah's smile faltered, but she nodded and withdrew, casting a glance at Raymond that lingered a moment too long. Poirot leaned back, stroking his mustache. The little grey cells, they were buzzing now. This was no ordinary family. This was a cauldron of suppressed desires, fear, and perhaps something more sinister. He had no intention of involving himself, of course. This was a holiday, after all. Yet, as he watched Mrs. Boynton rise, her children trailing her like shadows, he felt the familiar pull of a puzzle. "Hercule Poirot," he murmured to himself. "You are never truly on holiday, are you?" With a sigh, he finished his tisane and resolved to keep an eye on the Boyntons. Something told him their story was far from over. Chapter 2. The journey to Petra. The sun hung low over Jerusalem, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets as Hercule Poirot stepped from his hotel, his polished shoes clicking with purpose. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and jasmine, and the distant wail of a muezzin mingled with the clamour of merchants closing their stalls. Poirot's holiday, meant for quiet reflection, had already been disrupted by the peculiar tableau of the Boynton family at the café. Their tension, their unspoken resentments, had lodged in his mind like a burr, when he learned they were to join a tour to the ancient city of Petra. His curiosity, never one to be denied, prompted him to secure a place on the same expedition. "It is not interference, Hercule Poirot," he told himself, adjusting his tie, "merely observation." The tour group assembled at dawn outside the hotel, a motley collection of travellers gathered under the watchful eye of their guide. Mr. Mahmoud, a wiry man with a quick smile and an encyclopedic knowledge of the region. The Boyntons stood apart, a sombre cluster beneath the spreading branches of an olive tree. Mrs. Boynton, enthroned in a folding chair brought specially for her bulk, surveyed her family with the unyielding gaze of a monarch. Lennox, her eldest, stood with his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the ground as if searching for an escape in the dust. Nadine, his wife, hovered nearby, her auburn hair catching the morning light, her expression a careful mask of patience. Raymond and Carol, the dark-haired siblings, stood close together, their whispered conversation halting whenever their mother's eyes flicked toward them. Ginevra, the youngest, swayed slightly, her delicate features shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, her fingers twisting a silk scarf as if it were a lifeline. Jefferson Cope, the stepson, lingered at the edge of the group, his hands thrust into his pockets, his smile polite but strained. Poirot's attention was drawn to two other members of the tours. Sarah King, the young doctor he had seen at the café, stood near the bus, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. Her dark eyes sparkled with enthusiasm as she chatted with Mr. Mahmoud about Petra's history. But Poirot noted the way her gaze strayed to Raymond Boynton, who seemed oblivious to her interest. Beside her stood Dr. Theodore Gerard, a French psychologist with a lean frame and a thoughtful air. His spectacles glinted as he studied the Boyntons, his notebook tucked under his arm like a weapon. Poirot approached, offering a courteous bow. "Monsieur le Docteur," he said, "you seem most intrigued by our fellow travellers." Dr. Gerard's lips quirked in a faint smile. "I am a student of the human mind, Monsieur Poirot. That family," he nodded, "toward the Boyntons is a study in control and submission. The matriarch, she is formidable." "No." Poirot nodded, his moustache twitching. "Formidable, oui, and perhaps dangerous." Dr. Gerard raised an eyebrow but said no more, his attention returning to his notebook. The journey began in a rattle of wheels and a cloud of dust as the bus wound its way. Out of Jerusalem, through the arid hills of Judea, toward the desert beyond. Poirot sat near the front, his eyes sharp behind his tinted spectacles. The Boyntons occupied the rear seats, Mrs. Boynton's bulk taking up 2 spaces, her children arranged around her like satellites. Sarah King sat across the aisle from Raymond. Her attempts at conversation met with shy monosyllables. Jefferson Cope, seated alone, stared out the window, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on his knee. Poirot noted the way Mrs. Boynton's presence seemed to stifle the air itself. Her occasional commands, "Lennox, sit up straight. Carol, stop fidgeting," cutting through the hum of the engine like a blade. The road to Petra was long, the landscape growing ever more barren as the hours passed. The hills gave way to a vast expanse of red sand and jagged rock, the horizon shimmering with heat. Mr. Mahmoud, standing at the front of the bus, regaled the group with tales of the Nabateans, the ancient people who carved Petra from the cliffs. "A city hidden in stone," he said, his voice rich with pride, "a place of mystery and beauty." Sarah listened raptly, her notebook open, while Dr. Gerard scribbled his own observations, his pen moving with the precision of a surgeon. The Boyntons, however, remained silent, their faces closed, as if the wonders of Petra held no allure compared to the weight of their mother's will. At a brief stop near a Bedouin encampment, Poirot stepped off the bus to stretch his legs, his patent leather shoes an odd contrast to the dusty ground. Sarah King joined him, her face flushed with the heat. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "have you noticed the Boyntons? There's something wrong about them." Poirot tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Wrong, mademoiselle. Précisez si vous plot." Sarah hesitated, then lowered her voice. "It's Mrs. Boynton. She controls them, every move, every thought. It's not natural. Raymond, he's kind, intelligent, but he's like a prisoner." Poirot nodded slowly. "You are perceptive, Mademoiselle King. The mind, it can be as much a cage as any prison." As they reboarded, Poirot caught a glimpse of Jefferson Cope, speaking to Mrs. Boynton, his tone deferential but his posture stiff. "I've arranged for the chair at the camp, Mother," he said, using the familial term with an odd formality. Mrs. Boynton's response was a curt nod, her eyes narrowing as if weighing his worth. Poirot filed the moment away, his mind turning over the dynamics of this strange family. Jefferson, the outsider, seemed both bound to and resentful of his stepmother. Was it loyalty, fear, or something else that tethered him? The bus arrived at the camp near Petra as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the cliffs in shades of crimson and gold. Tents had been pitched in a sheltered valley, their canvas walls glowing under lantern light. Mr. Mahmoud directed the group to their accommodations, assuring them that the trek to Petra's heart would begin at dawn. Mrs. Boynton, too heavy to walk far, was carried to her tent in her chair by two Bedouin porters, her children trailing behind like a funeral procession. Poirot's tent was nearby, its interior spare but comfortable, and he took a moment to arrange his toiletries with his usual precision. Before joining the group for dinner, the meal was served under a canopy, the air filled with the aroma of roasted lamb and flatbread. The travellers sat on cushions, their plates balanced on low tables. Poirot, ever fastidious, wielded his knife and fork with elegance, drawing a curious glance from Sarah. "You're not like most tourists, Monsieur Poirot," she said, a smile playing on her lips. "Most tourists do not see what Hercule Poirot sees," he replied, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Across the table, Dr. Gerard leaned forward. "And what do you see in the Boyntons, monsieur? I confess, they fascinate me. The mother, she is a tyrant, but the children, they do not rebel. Why?" Poirot dabbed his lips with a napkin. "The why, monsieur le docteur, is always the key. Fear, perhaps, or love twisted into something else, or money." His gaze drifted to the Boynton table, where Mrs. Boynton ate slowly, her children picking at their food in silence. Jefferson Cope, seated at her right, offered her a glass of water, his movements careful, almost mechanical. Ginevra, at the far end, stared into the flickering lantern, her lips moving silently as if reciting a private litany. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "There is a pattern here," he murmured, "and patterns, they always lead to truth." After dinner, the group gathered around a fire, the desert night closing in with a chill that belied the day's heat. Mr. Mahmoud told stories of Petra's past caravans, kings, and hidden tombs, his voice weaving a spell over the listeners. Sarah sat near Raymond, her presence seeming to draw him out of his shell. "Have you ever dreamed of breaking free?" she asked softly, her words meant only for him. Raymond's face tightened, and he glanced at his mother, who was watching from her chair like a hawk. "Dreams don't matter," he said, his voice barely audible. "She decides everything." Sarah's eyes flashed with indignation, but she said no more, her hand brushing his in a fleeting gesture of comfort. Poirot, seated on a cushion near Dr. Gerard, listened to the exchange with half an ear. His attention was on Mrs. Boynton, whose presence seemed to cast a shadow even in the firelight. Lennox and Nadine sat stiffly, their hands not touching. Carol's eyes darted between her mother and Raymond, a silent plea in her gaze. Ginevra, lost in her own world, hummed a tuneless melody, her fingers still twisting her scarf. Jefferson Cope rose to fetch a shawl for Mrs. Boynton, his solicitude almost theatrical. Poirot's moustache twitched. "The performance," he thought. "It is too perfect. What does he hide?" As the fire died down, the group dispersed to their tents, the stars blazing overhead in a sky untouched by city lights. Poirot lingered, his mind sifting through the day's observations. The Boyntons were a puzzle, each piece shaped by fear, duty, or resentment. Mrs. Boynton, the centre of their universe, was no mere domineering mother. She was a force, a will that bent all others to her own. Yet Poirot sensed a crack in her. Control, a fault line that threatened to shatter the family's fragile equilibrium. Was it in Raymond's quiet rebellion, Nadine's strained patience, Jefferson's too smooth deference, or Ginevra's fragile mind? He retired to his tent, his thoughts as relentless as the desert wind. "Hercule Poirot," he murmured, arranging his pillows with care, "you have stumbled upon a drama, and dramas, they often end in tragedy." He closed his eyes, but sleep was slow to come. The The little grey cells, they were awake, piecing together the fragments of a story that had only begun to unfold. Tomorrow, in the rose-red city of Petra, the next act would begin, and Poirot would be watching. Chapter 3. The grip tightens. The dawn broke over Petra with a flush of rose and amber, the cliffs of the ancient city glowing as if lit from within. Hercule Poirot stood at the entrance to the sick, the narrow gorge that led to Petra's heart, his straw hat tilted against the rising sun. The air was cool, carrying the faint tang of dust and stone, and the chatter of the tour group mingled with the clop of donkeys' hooves. Poirot's eyes, sharp behind his tinted spectacles, scanned the scene, but his thoughts lingered on the Boynton family, whose strained dynamics had already marked them as a puzzle worthy of his attention. Today he resolved to observe them closely, for in the crucible of Petra's isolation, secrets had a way of rising to the surface. The group gathered at the camp's edge, where Mr. Mahmoud, the guide, briefed them on the day's itinerary: a trek through the sick to the treasury, followed by a visit to the royal tombs. Mrs. Boynton, her bulk swathed in a dark shawl, had declared herself unfit for the walk and would remain at the camp, attended by a Bedouin servant. Her children, freed from her immediate presence, seemed to exhale, though their relief was tempered by an unspoken wariness. Lennox Boynton, his face drawn, adjusted his hat with mechanical precision, while Nadine, his wife, stood at his side, her auburn hair tucked beneath a scarf, her eyes scanning the horizon as if seeking an escape. Raymond and Carol exchanged quick glances, their movements restless, while Ginevra, the youngest, clutched a sketchbook, her gaze darting as if expecting a reprimand. Jefferson Cope, the stepson, hovered near the group, his smile as polished as ever. But Poirot noted a tension in his jaw, a flicker of something unguarded. Sarah King, the young doctor, approached Poirot, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low, "this place, it's magical, isn't it? But the Boyntons, they seem out of place, like shadows in all this light." Poirot inclined his head, his moustache curving slightly. "You have the eye of a poet, Mademoiselle King, and perhaps the heart of one, Nan. Tell me, what do you make of their shadows?" Sarah's brow furrowed. "They're afraid, not just of her, but of what she's made them. Raymond, he wants to be free. I can see it, but he's trapped." Poirot nodded, filing away her insight. Sarah's interest in Raymond was more than academic, he suspected, and such attachments often sharpened one's observations. Dr. Theodore Gerard, the French psychologist, joined them, his notebook already open. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice crisp, "I have been watching the Boyntons. The mother's control is not merely domineering. It is pathological, a form of mental tyranny. Her children are like puppets, their strings pulled by her will." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A striking metaphor, Monsieur le Docteur. But puppets, they sometimes cut their strings, do they not?" Gerard's lips twitched. "Sometimes, but at what cost?" The question hung in the air as the group set off, leaving Mrs. Boynton behind, her chair a throne in the desert. The sick was a marvel, its towering walls closing in like the jaws of some ancient beast. The group walked in single file, their footsteps echoing off the stone. Poirot, ever fastidious, picked his way carefully, his cane tapping a steady rhythm. Ahead, Raymond and Carol walked side by side, their heads bent in conversation. Poirot strained to catch their words, but the wind carried "only fragments, can't go on" from Carol, and "if only we could" from Raymond. Their voices were urgent, almost conspiratorial, and Poirot's curiosity deepened. Were they plotting escape, or something darker? Sarah King fell into step beside Raymond, her manner easy but deliberate. "This place feels alive, doesn't it?" she said, gesturing to the carved façades peeking through the gorge. Raymond's face softened, a rare smile breaking through. "It's like another world," he said, his voice low. "A world where she doesn't exist." Sarah's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly, steering the conversation to the Nabateans. Poirot, a few paces behind, noted the exchange. Raymond's words were reckless, a crack in the facade of obedience. Did they hint at intent? At the Treasury, the group paused, awestruck by the rose-red facade carved into the cliff. Mr. Mahmoud launched into a lecture on its history, but Poirot's attention was elsewhere. Jefferson Cope had lingered at the rear, his sketchbook open but his pencil idle. Poirot approached, his tone genial. "You are an artist, Monsieur Cope." Jefferson started, closing the book quickly. "Oh, just a hobby, Monsieur Poirot. I like to capture the moment." Poirot's eyes flicked to his hands, clean and unblemished, unlike those of a man who had been sketching in the dusty sick. "A fine pursuit," Poirot said, "but one that requires time, Nan." Jefferson's smile tightened, and he excused himself, moving toward Nadine, who was photographing the Treasury. The group dispersed to explore, and Poirot found a shaded ledge from which to observe. Lennox and Nadine wandered toward the nearby caves, their silence heavy. Carol joined Sarah and Raymond, her presence cooling their conversation. Ginevra sat alone, her sketchbook open, her pencil moving in erratic bursts. Poirot approached her, his manner gentle. "You draw the beauty of Petra, mademoiselle." Ginevra's eyes, wide and unfocused, met his. "Not beauty," she said, her voice a whisper. "The spirits, they live in the stones." Her words were strange, almost theatrical, and Poirot wondered if her mind wandered or if she played a part. He glanced at her sketcher, chaotic swirl of lines, more nightmare than art. Midday brought the group back to the camp for lunch. The heat, now oppressive. Mrs. Boynton sat under a canvas awning, her eyes sweeping over her family as they returned. "You've been dawdling, Lennox," she said, her voice a low rasp. "And you, Raymond, you're flushed. What nonsense have you been talking?" Raymond's face reddened further, but he said nothing, taking his seat. Carol's hands clenched, and Nadine's gaze dropped to her plate. Jefferson, serving his stepmother a glass of lemonade, murmured, "It's the heat, Mother. Everyone's a bit tired." Mrs. Boynton's lips curled, a smile that held no warmth. "Tiredness is weakness," she said. "We Boyntons are not weak." Poirot, seated nearby, sipped his water, his mind cataloguing the scene. The matriarch's control was absolute, yet cracks were visible. Lennox's apathy, Nadine's restraint, Raymond's fleeting defiance, Carol's suppressed anger. Ginevra's detachment, all were symptoms of a family under siege. Jefferson, though, was the enigma. His deference seemed calculated, his presence a careful balance between loyalty and distance. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by Dr. Gerard, who sat beside him, his notebook discreetly closed. "She thrives on their fear," Gerard said softly. "It is not just control, it is power, pure and cruel." Poirot nodded. "And power, Monsieur le Docteur, it invites rebellion." The afternoon was spent exploring the royal tombs, their vast façades a testament to a lost civilization. Poirot, feigning a need for rest, lingered near the camp, watching Mrs. Boynton from a distance. She sat alone, her servant dismissed, her eyes fixed on the horizon. A shadow passed a Bedouin guide, then Jefferson, carrying his sketchbook. He paused near her, their conversation inaudible but brief. Poirot noted the time, just past 2 o'clock. Jefferson's movements were too deliberate, his departure too swift. Was he sketching, as he claimed, or was there another purpose? As the group returned at dusk, their faces sunburned and weary, Poirot caught Sarah King's eye. "You have spent much time with young Raymond," he said, his tone light. Sarah flushed. "He's different when he's away from her. There's a spark in him, a hope." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Hope, mademoiselle. It is a dangerous thing in a family such as this." Sarah's expression hardened. "Maybe hope is what they need," she said, and walked away, her shoulders squared. Dinner was a subdued affair, the fire casting long shadows across the camp. Mrs. Boynton's presence dominated, her occasional remarks stifling conversation. Raymond and Carol ate in silence, their earlier camaraderie gone. Ginevra hummed softly, her eyes distant. Jefferson, ever attentive, refilled his stepmother's glass, his smile unwavering. Poirot, watching, felt the weight of an impending storm. The Boyntons were a powder keg, and Petra, with its ancient secrets, was the perfect stage for a tragedy. Tomorrow, he thought, settling into his tent, the little grey cells, they must be ready. The desert night closed in, silent but for the whisper of the wind, carrying with it the promise of revelation. Chapter 4. The fatal afternoons the sun beat down on Petra with unrelenting ferocity, its rays carving sharp shadows across the rose-red cliffs. Hercule Poirot, ever mindful of his impeccable attire, adjusted his straw hat to shield his face as he lingered near the camp, ostensibly to rest his legs after the morning's exertions. In truth, his little grey cells were at work, piecing together the mosaic of the Boynton family's strained dynamics. The second day in Petra promised new revelations, and Poirot, with his unerring instinct for the unusual, sensed that the day held more than the mere exploration of ancient ruins. The tour group had dispersed after breakfast, most heading toward the monastery, a distant monument reached by a steep climb. Mrs. Boynton, her bulk unsuited to such treks, remained at the camp, seated in her folding chair under the canvas awning like a queen holding court. Her children, freed from her immediate scrutiny, had joined the others, though their movements lacked the carefree enthusiasm of typical tourists. Lennox and Nadine walked together, their silence heavy with unspoken burdens. Raymond and Carol, trailed by Sarah King, moved as a trio, their conversation hushed and furtive. Ginevra, ever ethereal, wandered alone, her sketchbook clutched like a talisman. Jefferson Cope, however, had declared his intention to sketch near the camp, citing a desire to capture the play of light on the cliffs. Poirot noted his pristine linen shirt, unmarred by the dust that clung to everyone else, and filed the observation away. At noon, the camp was quiet, save for the soft clink of dishes as the Bedouin staff cleared the breakfast tables. Mrs. Boynton sat alone, her small, glittering eyes fixed on the horizon, a glass of water at her side. Poirot, seated on a bench nearby with a book he did not read, watched as Jefferson approached her, carrying a leather case. "Mother," he said, his voice smooth, "I brought you some fresh water. The heat is fierce today." Mrs. Boynton's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. "You're thoughtful, Jefferson," she said, accepting the glass. He lingered a moment, adjusting her shawl, then retreated to a nearby rock, opening his sketchbook with deliberate care. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The pencil in Jefferson's hand moved little, if at all, by 1 o'clock. The heat had driven most of the staff to seek shade, leaving the camp nearly deserted. Poirot, feigning a nap, kept his eyes half open, his mind alert. A Bedouin guide passed through, nodding to Mrs. Boynton, who acknowledged him with a curt gesture. At 1:15, Jefferson rose, glanced around, and approached his stepmother again, this time empty-handed. Their exchange was brief, inaudible to Poirot, but he noted the way Jefferson's shoulders stiffened, as if bracing for a rebuke. He then walked swiftly toward the sick, his case tucked under his arm. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Curio," he murmured. "The artist, he does not sketch." At 3 o'clock, a cry shattered the stillness. One of the Bedouin servants, returning with a tray of tea, dropped it with a clatter. Mrs. Boynton sat slumped in her chair, her head lolling to one side, her eyes unseeing. The servants' shouts drew the staff, and soon the camp buzzed with alarm. Poirot was on his feet in an instant, his cane tapping as he hurried to the scene. Dr. Theodore Gerard, who had returned early from the monastery, knelt beside Mrs. Boynton, his fingers pressed to her wrist. "She is dead," he announced, his voice steady but grim. He leaned closer, examining her arm. "There is a mark here, small puncture, like from a needle." Sarah King, arriving breathless from the trail, pushed through the gathering crowd. "Let me see," she said, her medical training taking over. She confirmed Gerard's observation, her brow furrowing. It could be a heart attack. She was not a healthy woman, but this mark. It's suspicious. Poirot, standing back, observed the reactions of those present. The Bedouin staff whispered among themselves, their eyes wide with superstition. Mr. Mahmoud, the guide, wrung his hands, muttering about the curse of Petra's spirits. But Poirot's attention was on the Boyntons, who began to return as word spread. Lennox and Nadine arrived first, their faces pale but composed. Lennox stared at his mother's body, his expression unreadable, while Nadine's hand gripped his arm, her knuckles white. Raymond and Carol appeared next, their steps halting. Raymond's eyes widened, a flicker of something relief, perhaps, crossing his face before he masked it. Carol's lips parted, but no sound came. She clutched her brother's sleeve, her fingers trembling. Ginevra, trailing behind, let out a theatrical wail, collapsing to her knees with a cry of the spirits, they've taken her. Her performance drew curious glances, but Poirot noted its excess, as if she played a role rehearsed too often. Jefferson Cope was the last to arrive, his sketchbook still under his arm, his face a study in calm. "Sorrow, mother," he said softly, kneeling beside her, though his hands did not touch her. Poirot stepped forward, his voice quiet but commanding. "Monsieur Mahmoud, please ensure no one disturbs the scene. We must wait for the authorities." He turned to Dr. Gerard. "Monsieur le Docteur, your professional opinion, si vous." "Plot." Gerard straightened, his spectacles glinting. "The puncture suggests an injection, possibly a drug like digitalis, which could induce heart failure. But without an autopsy, I cannot be certain. The heat and her condition may have contributed, but—" He trailed off, his gaze meeting Poirot's. The unspoken word hung between them. Murder, Sarah King. Her hands, still trembling from her examination, approached Poirot. "I saw Jefferson near the camp earlier," she said, her voice low. "Around 1 o'clock. maybe a bit later. He was carrying that case, and he looked nervous. Poirot nodded, his mind racing. Mercy, Mademoiselle King. Your observation, it is most valuable. He turned to the group, his eyes sweeping over the Boyntons. No one must leave the camp until we have clarity. The truth, it will not hide in the shadows of Petra. As the group dispersed, murmuring among themselves, Poirot lingered near Mrs. Boynton's body, his gaze fixed on the puncture mark. The desert sun beat down, but a chill settled in his bones. This was no natural death. The little grey cells were certain of it. The Boyntons, each bound by their mother's iron will, now faced a new reality, one where freedom came at a deadly price. Jefferson's calm demeanour, Sarah's sighting, and the mysterious puncture mark formed a pattern, incomplete but ominous. Poirot's thoughts turned to the hours ahead. The game, it has begun, he murmured, his eyes gleaming with purpose. And Hercule Poirot, he will play it to the end. Chapter 5. The Web of Motives. The sun dipped below the cliffs of Petra, casting the camp into a twilight glow that softened the harsh edges of the day's tragedy. Hercule Poirot stood apart from the murmuring tour group, his hands clasped behind. His back, his eyes fixed on the now covered form of Mrs. Boynton, draped with a sheet by the Bedouin staff. The authorities had been summoned, but the desert's isolation meant their arrival would be delayed until morning. This suited Poirot perfectly. It gave him time to unravel the threads of what he was certain was a murder. The puncture mark on Mrs. Boynton's wrist, the whispered resentments of her family, and the curious behaviour of Jefferson Cope formed a tapestry of suspicion. And Poirot's little grey cells were already weaving the pattern together. The camp was subdued, the usual chatter of the travellers replaced by uneasy glances and hushed voices. Mr. Mahmoud, the guide, paced nervously, muttering about the ill luck of death in Petra. Dr. Theodore Gerard sat under the canvas awning, his notebook open, his pen scratching as he recorded his observations. Sarah King, her face pale but resolute, lingered near the Boyntons, her eyes flickering with concern as she watched Raymond. The family itself had gathered in a tight knot near their tents, their expressions a mix of shock, relief, and something less definable. Poirot approached, his manner calm but purposeful, knowing that the hours after a crime were critical. When emotions were raw and tongues less guarded, he began with Lennox Boynton, the eldest, whose gaunt frame and hollow eyes suggested a man. Long worn down, Monsieur Boynton, Poirot said, his voice gentle but firm, "May I have a word?" Lennox nodded, stepping away from the others, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his tone flat. Poirot tilted his head, studying him. "Your mother, she was a woman of great influence, Nan. Her death, it changes much for you." Lennox's jaw tightened. "She controlled everything. Money, our lives now. I don't know what happens now." His eyes met Poirot's briefly, then dropped. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you're thinking. I didn't have the strength." Poirot noted the bitterness in his voice, the weight of years under his mother's thumb. "And yet," he said, "freedom, it is a powerful motive, is it not?" Lennox said nothing, turning away, his silence louder than words. Next, Poirot approached Nadine, who stood apart, her auburn hair glinting in the lantern light. "Madame Boynton," he said, bowing slightly, "you have my condolences, but I must ask, did you notice anything unusual today, before the tragedy?" Nadine's eyes, sharp with intelligence, met his. "Unusual, no, Monsieur Poirot. She was, as she always was, demanding, unyielding. But I was with Lennox at the monastery all afternoon. We didn't return until after. She hesitated, her fingers twisting her wedding ring. We were trapped, all of us. Her money, her willet, bound us like chains. But I didn't kill her. Her voice held a quiet desperation, and Poirot sensed truth, but also a withheld fear. "Mercy, madame," he said, letting her go, his mind noting her loyalty to Lennox and, perhaps, her own secrets. Raymond and Carol were together, their dark heads bent close, their voices low. Poirot approached with care, aware of their guarded nature. "Monsieur, mademoiselle," he said, "a moment, si vous plot." Raymond's eyes flickered with unease, while Carol's were defiant. "What do you want?" she asked sharply. Poirot smiled, disarming, only to understand. "Your mother, she was a formidable presence. Her passing, it must bring relief." Raymond flinched, his face spulling. "That's a cruel thing to say," he muttered, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of guilt. Carol's hand gripped his arm. "We hated how she controlled us," she said, her voice fierce, "but we didn't kill her. We were at the monastery with Sarah." Poirot nodded, noting their alibi, but also the intensity of their reaction. "Hate," he said softly, "it is a heavy burden, Nan." They said no more, retreating into silence, their bond a shield against his probing. Ginevra, the youngest, sat alone on a cushion, her sketchbook abandoned, her eyes staring into the fire. Poirot approached cautiously, sensing her fragility. "Mademoiselle Ginevra," he said, his voice as soft as a lullaby, "you loved your mother. We—" Ginevra's head snapped up, her eyes wide and wild. Love, she was. She was everything. The spirits took her, didn't they? The stones, they whispered it. Her words were a jumble, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. Poirot studied her, wondering if her mind was truly unmoored, or if she hid behind this façade. "The spirits, mademoiselle, they do not leave puncture marks," he said gently. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and Poirot saw fear in her eyes, not of him, but of something deeper. Jefferson Cope was the last, standing near his tent, his sketchbook still clutched like a prop. Poirot approached, his manner genial but his eyes sharp. "Monsieur Cope, you were close to your stepmother, Nan, a devoted son." Jefferson's smile was practiced, but it did not reach his eyes. "She raised me after my father died," he said. "I owed her everything. Her heart, it was weak. You know, the heat must have been too much." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet, a puncture mark, it is not the work of heat, is it?" Jefferson's smile faltered. "I wouldn't know, Monsieur Poirot. I was sketching all afternoon, nowhere near her." His voice was steady, but his fingers tightened on the sketchbook. Poirot nodded, letting him go, but his mind marked the lie. Jefferson's hands were too clean for an artist in the dusty desert. Poirot sought out Sarah King, who stood near the fire, her face troubled. "Mademoiselle," he said, "you have a doctor's eye. What do you make of this death?" Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line that markets like an injection. "Sight, digitalis maybe, or something similar. It could stop a heart, make it look natural. I saw Jefferson near her at 1 o'clock, carrying that case." He looked furtive. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Furtive, you say? Most interesting." He turned to Dr. Gerard, who had joined them, his notebook tucked away. "Monsieur le Docteur, a word. Your medical kit, has anything been misplaced?" Gerard's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, a syringe is missing. I noticed this morning, but thought it mislaid in the chaos of travel." Poirot's moustache twitched. A syringe. It does not mislay itself, Nan. As the camp settled for the night, Poirot paced beneath the stars, his mind a whirl of motives and opportunities. Mrs. Boynton's wealth, her control, had chained her family, but her death promised freedom and inheritance. Lennox's apathy masked a deep resentment. Nadine's loyalty to him hinted at her own desperation. Raymond and Carol's whispered rebellion suggested a shared dream of escape. Ginevra's erratic behavior could be madness or a clever mask. Jefferson, the outsider, stood to gain little unless the others were cut off, and his calm façade hid a calculating mind. The missing syringe, the puncture mark. Sarah's sight angle pointed to a deliberate act, planned with precision. Poirot paused, gazing at the cliffs that loomed like silent sentinels. "The web, it is intricate," he murmured, "but every web has a spider, and Hercule Poirot, he will find it." The night was still, but the air thrummed with the weight of secrets, and Poirot knew the truth was close, waiting to be plucked from the shadows of Petra. Chapter 6. The timeline unravels. The morning sun rose over Petra, its rays piercing the camp with a relentless clarity that mirrored Hercule Poirot's resolve. The air was thick with dust and the faint hum of anticipation, as if the ancient cliffs themselves awaited the unfolding of the drama. Mrs. Boynton's body had been moved to a shaded tent, pending the arrival of the authorities, and the tour group, though subdued, went about their morning routines with a nervous energy. Poirot, his suit immaculate despite the desert's assault, stood near the breakfast table, his eyes scanning the faces of the Boynton family. The little grey cells were at work, piecing together the fragments of the previous day, and he was determined to unravel the precise sequence of events that had led to the matriarch's death. Poirot's first task was to establish a timeline, for he knew that in the architecture of murder, time was the foundation. He approached Mr. Mahmoud, the guide, who was sipping coffee and muttering about the ill omen of death in Petra. "Monsieur Mahmoud," Poirot said, his voice smooth but insistent, "you saw Madame Boynton yesterday, oui. At what hour was she last alive?" Mahmoud's eyes widened, his hands gesturing nervously. "At 1 o'clock, Monsieur Poirot. I brought her tea. She was sitting in her chair, as always, watching the camp like a hawk. She waved me away, said she needed nothing." Poirot nodded, fixing the time in his mind. "And after that, you saw no one approach her?" Mahmoud shook his head. "I was busy with the donkeys until the discovery." Next, Poirot sought out Dr. Theodore Gerard, who was examining his medical kit with a furrowed brow. "Monsieur le Docteur," Poirot said, "the puncture mark on Madame Whodunit suggests a precise method, Nan. A drug, perhaps administered. With your missing syringe." Gerard's spectacles glinted as he met Poirot's gaze. Indeed, the mark was small, clean, like that of a hypodermic needle. Digitalis, in a high dose, could cause heart failure, especially in a woman of her age and condition. It would appear natural unless one looked closely. Poirot's moustache twitched, and the syringe, it remains missing. Gerard nodded. "I've searched my tent thoroughly. It was there 2 days ago, but now, gone." Poirot's eyes narrowed. A missing syringe was no accident. It was a clue, deliberate and damning. Sarah King approached, her face drawn from a sleepless night. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low, "I've been thinking about what I saw yesterday." Jefferson Cope was near the camp at 1:15, carrying that leather case. "I was coming back from the monastery, and he was walking quickly, as if he didn't want to be seen." Poirot's interest sharpened. 1:15, you say, and his demeanour, it was furtive, oui. Sarah nodded. Yes, exactly. He glanced around, then headed toward the sick. I thought it odd he said he was sketching all afternoon. Poirot's mind raced. Sarah's observation placed Jefferson near Mrs. Boynton shortly after Mahmoud's last sighting of her alive. The timeline was tightening. Poirot turned his attention to the Boyntons, who sat together at breakfast, their faces a study in contrasts. Lennox's apathy seemed deeper, as if the weight of his mother's death had settled into his bones. Eyes were red-rimmed, but her posture was rigid, her hands steady as she poured tea. Raymond and Carol sat close, their conversation a murmur, while Ginevra, at the table's edge, traced patterns in the sand with a stick, her expression vacant. Jefferson Cope was absent, and Poirot learned from a Bedouin servant that he had gone to sketch near the treasury. Always sketching, that one Poirot murmured, his tone laced with skepticism. He approached the family, his manner courteous but direct. Madame et messieurs, he said, I seek only to understand the events of yesterday. Monsieur Cope, he claims he was sketching from 12:30 to 2:30, oui. Raymond's head snapped up, his eyes wary. That's what he said. We were all at the monastery then. Carol nodded, her voice sharp. We didn't get back until after 3, when they found her. Lennox's voice was low, almost a whisper. I was with Nadine. We didn't see anything. Nadine's hand touched his briefly, a gesture of support. But her eyes avoided Poirot's. Ginevra, unprompted, giggled softly. The Stones saw everything, she said, her voice eerie. Poirot studied her, wondering if her words were madness or misdirection. A Bedouin boy, no older than 12, approached with a tray of fruit, and Poirot seized the opportunity. Mon petit, he said, his tone kind. You were in the camp yesterday, oui. Did you see Monsieur Cope? The boy nodded, his eyes bright. Yes, Effendi. He was near the big lady's chair at 1 o'clock. Maybe a little after. He had a case, like for papers. Then he went away fast. Poirot's heart quickened. The boy's testimony contradicted Jefferson's alibi, placing him at the camp at a critical moment. Mercy, mon ami, Poirot said, slipping the boy a coin. The timeline was now a net, closing around a lie. Poirot found Jefferson near the treasury, his sketchbook open but his pencil idle. Monsieur Cope, Poirot said, his voice deceptively mild. You were sketching yesterday, you say, from 12:30 to 2:30. Jefferson's smile was quick, too. Quick, yes, Monsieur Poirot. The light here is extraordinary. I was capturing the cliffs. Poirot gestured to the sketchbook. May I see? Jefferson hesitated, then opened the book, revealing a few rough sketches, none dated, none detailed. The work of an amateur, Poirot said, his tone neutral, but his eyes noted the absence of dust on Jefferson's hands, the pristine state of his pages. You were not at the camp at 1:15, perhaps, near your stepmother. Jefferson's smile faltered. No, I was here. You must be mistaken. Poirot nodded, letting the lie hang in the air. Returning to the camp, Poirot conferred with Dr. Gerard and Sarah under the awning. The timeline, it is clear, he said. Madame Boynton was alive at 1 o'clock, seen by Mahmoud. By 3 o'clock, she was dead. At 1:15, Monsieur Cope was seen near her, despite his claim of sketching elsewhere. A syringe is missing, and a puncture mark suggests a drug. Sarah's eyes widened. You think Jefferson injected her? Poirot raised a hand. I think. Only what the facts permit, mademoiselle. But the facts, they are stubborn, Nan. Gerard nodded grimly. Digitalis, if administered, would act quickly. The heat, her conditionate, would mask the cause. Poirot paced, his cane tapping the ground. The timeline pointed to Jefferson, but motives abounded. Lennox, Nadine, Raymond, and Carol all chafed under Mrs. Boynton's control, their lives, bound by her wealth and will. Ginevra's strangeness could be a façade, though her motive was less clear. Jefferson, as the stepson, stood to gain little directly, but his presence at the critical moment, his weak alibi, and the missing syringe formed a damning constellation. The truth, Poirot murmured, it lies in the gaps, the moments now. One sees. The day stretched ahead, and with it, the promise of answers. Poirot's eyes gleamed with determination. The net was tightening, and the killer would not escape. Chapter 7. The family's secrets. The desert sun climbed higher over Petra, its heat pressing down on the camp like a tangible weight. Hercule Poirot, undeterred by the sweltering air, sat beneath a canvas awning, his notebook open but his eyes fixed on the Boynton family. The death of Mrs. Boynton had shifted the atmosphere, loosening some bonds while tightening others, and Poirot knew that secrets, like shadows, grew sharper in the light of tragedy. His little grey cells hummed, piecing together the motives and movements of those entangled in the matriarch's web. Today he would probe deeper, seeking the hidden truths that lay beneath the family's guarded façades. The camp was quieter now, the initial shock of Mrs. Boynton's death settling into a tense unease. The authorities had yet to arrive, delayed by the desert's vastness, giving Poirot precious hours to pursue his inquiries. The Boyntons, scattered around the camp, were a study in contrasts. Lennox sat alone, staring at the cliffs as if they held answers. Nadine busied herself with a sewing kit, her movements precise but her eyes distant. Raymond and Carol stood near their tent, their voices low but urgent. Ginevra wandered the camp's edge, her sketchbook forgotten, her lips moving in silent conversation. Jefferson Cope, ever the outlier, was absent, supposedly sketching again, though Poirot suspected his absences served another purpose. Poirot began with Nadine, approaching her as she sat mending a torn scarf. "Madame Boynton," he said, his tone courteous, "you have endured much under your mother-in-law's rule, Nan. Her death, it changes your future, does it not?" Nadine's needle paused, her eyes meeting his with a guarded intensity. "You're direct, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice low. "Yes, she controlled us, our money, our choices. Lennox, he's been broken by her. I stayed for him, but I was planning to leave. She knew, and she hated me for it." Poirot tilted his head. "To leave, madame, that would require great courage." Nadine's lips tightened. "Courage or desperation. But I didn't kill her. I was with Lennox at the monastery all afternoon." Her words were firm, but Poirot noted a flicker of fear of discovery, or of something else. Next, he sought out Lennox, who sat on a rock, his gaunt face etched with exhaustion. "Monsieur Boynton," Poirot said, "your mother's wealth. It was a chain, now that chain is broken." Lennox's eyes, dull and weary, met Poirot's. "She held everything, our inheritance, our lives. I hated her for it, but I'm no murderer. I was with Nadine, climbing those cursed steps to the monastery. Ask anyone." His voice was flat, almost lifeless, but Poirot sensed a buried anger, smouldering beneath years of submission, hatred. Monsieur Poirot said softly, "It can push a man to act, even against his nature." Lennox shook his head, turning away, his silence a wall Poirot could not yet breach. Raymond and Carol were together. As always, their bond a fortress against the world. Poirot approached, his manner disarming. "Monsieur, mademoiselle, you shared your mother's yoke, Nan. Her death, it brings freedom, perhaps." Raymond's face flushed, his hands clenching. "Freedom, maybe, but we didn't kill her. We were with Sarah King, exploring the tombs. We only came back when we heard the shouts." Carol's eyes flashed. "You think we're monsters, don't you? She was our mother, even if she made life hell." Her voice cracked, and Poirot saw genuine pain, but also defiance. "Hell, mademoiselle," he said. "It can make monsters of us all, Nan." Their alibis were consistent, but Poirot noted Raymond's quick glance at Carol, as if seeking her strength. Ginevra was harder to reach, sitting cross-legged in the sand, her eyes fixed on a distant rock formation. "Mademoiselle Ginevra," Poirot said, crouching beside her. "You speak of spirits, but what do you know of your mother's death?" Her head turned, her gaze unfocused, almost otherworldly. "She was too strong for the spirits," she whispered. "They took her because she wouldn't bend. I saw them in the stones, watching." Poirot studied her, his mind weighing her. Words, was she truly lost in delusion, or was this a performance to deflect suspicion? "And you, mademoiselle, where were you when the spirits struck?" Ginevra's smile was eerie, wandering. "The stones called me." Her vagueness was maddening, but Poirot sensed a thread of truth beneath her strangeness. Jefferson Cope returned to the camp as Poirot was finishing his tea, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, his linen suit still improbably clean. Poirot intercepted him, his smile polite but probing. "Monsieur Cope, your devotion to your stepmother was admirable, yet her will, it favored her blood children, not you." Jefferson's eyes narrowed, but his smile held. "I didn't need her money, Monsieur Poirot. I cared for her out of duty. I was sketching when she didasked the guides." Poirot's mustache twitched. "The guides, they see much, but not everything. Your presence at 1:15, near her is curious, Nan." Jefferson's composure slipped, his fingers tightening on the sketchbook. "You're mistaken. I was nowhere near her then." Poirot nodded, letting the lie linger, knowing it would fester as the afternoon waned. Poirot conferred with Dr. Theodore Gerard and Sarah King near the camp's water station. The family, Poirot said, they are bound by a will that promised wealth but demanded obedience. Each had reason to wish her gone. Sarah's eyes were troubled. "Raymond and Carol, they're so trapped, but they were with me. I don't believe they could kill." Gerard's voice was grim. "Motive is not enough, Monsieur Poirot. The syringe, the puncture mark, they point to planning, not passion." Poirot nodded. "Exactement, and Jefferson Cope, his alibi crumbles. The boy saw him, Sarah saw him, yet he denies it." Sarah frowned. "He's so calm, though. Too calm, maybe." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Calm, mademoiselle, is the mask of a man who calculates." Poirot paced the camp's edge, his cane, tracing lines in the sand. The family secrets were emerging. Nadine's plan to leave, Lennox's buried rage, Raymond and Carol's shared desperation, Ginevra's elusive mind, Jefferson's precarious position as the outsider. The will, with its promise of wealth, was a motive for all, but the method of syringe, a drug suggested a cold intellect. Jefferson's movements, his weak alibi, and his access to the camp made him the focal point, but Poirot knew better than to leap to conclusions. "The truth," he murmured, gazing at the cliffs. "It is close, but it hides in the shadows." The day was fading, and with it the chance to uncover more before the authorities arrived. Poirot's resolve hardened. The next move was his, and he would play it with precision. Chapter 8. The Psychological Kether. Desert night enveloped Petra, its stars a glittering canopy over the silent camp. Hercule Poirot, undeterred by the late hour, sat in his tent, a lantern casting soft shadows across his notebook. The death of Mrs. Boynton hung over the camp like a spectre, and the little grey cells were restless, sifting through the day's revelations. The puncture mark, the missing syringe, Jefferson Cope's faltering alibi all pointed to a calculated act. But Poirot knew that murder was as much a matter of the mind as of the means. To unravel this crime, he needed to understand the psychological currents that ran through the Boynton family, currents that had surged into a deadly tide. Poirot's first task was to consult Dr. Theodore Gerard, whose expertise in psychology might illuminate the family's dynamics. He found the Frenchman near the fire, his spectacles reflecting the flames as he scribbled in his notebook. "Monsieur le Docteur," Poirot said, settling beside him, "you have studied the Boyntons. Tell me, what drives a family to such submission, and what might break it?" Gerard closed his notebook, his expression grave. "Mrs. Boynton was a tyrant, Monsieur Poirot, but not of the usual sort. Her control was not merely was psychological. She crushed their spirits, made them dependent on her approval. Such dominance creates resentment, even hatred, but also paralysis. Her children could not act against her without shattering their own identities." Poirot's eyes gleamed, "And yet someone acted Nan. The puncture mark, it is not the work of paralysis." Gerard nodded, his voice low. "Exactly. The method likely, delivered by syringe requires forethought, precision. This was no impulsive act, but one born of cold resolve. The killer despised her enough to plan, yet feared her enough to hide their hand." Poirot leaned forward, his moustache twitching. "And who, in your professional opinion, is capable of such resolve?" Gerard hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Lennox is too broken, Nadine too loyal to him. Raymond and Carol share a spark of rebellion, but they lean on each other, not on cunning. Ginevra's mind is unstable, perhaps a mask, but I doubt her capacity for such planning. Jefferson Cope, however, he is different, an outsider yet bound to her. His deference hides something darker, I think." Poirot nodded, filing away. Gerard's insights. "A spider's web, Monsieur le Docteur, and we must find the spider." The next morning, as the camp stirred under a pale dawn, Poirot sought physical evidence to complement the psychological. He requested permission from Mr. Matmode to examine Jefferson's tent, citing the need to clarify details of the tragedy. Mahmoud, anxious to restore calm, agreed, and Poirot, accompanied by a reluctant Bedouin servant, entered the small canvas space. Jefferson's belongings were orderly: a neatly made cat, a small suitcase, and the ubiquitous sketchbook. Poirot opened the book, finding only a handful of sketches, none from the fatal afternoon, and all curiously pristine. His fingers brushed the leather case Jefferson often carried, and inside, tucked beneath a false lining, he found a small glass vial, half filled with a clear liquid. Poirot's heart quickened. He slipped the vial into a handkerchief, careful not to touch it directly, and handed it to the servant with instructions to keep it safe. Poirot then sought out Sarah King, who was packing her medical bag near the breakfast table. "Mademoiselle King," he said, "you are a doctor. If I were to show you a substance, could you identify it?" Sarah's eyes narrowed, sensing his purpose. "If it's a drug, possibly. What have you found?" Poirot produced the vial, holding it carefully in the handkerchief. Sarah examined it, her face tightening. "It looks like digitalis, Monsieur Poirot. It's used for heart conditions, but in excess, it's lethal. Where did you find this?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "In a place where it should not be, mademoiselle. Say nothing for now. Si vous plaît." Sarah nodded, her expression a mix of concern and determination. Armed with this discovery, Poirot confronted Jefferson Cope, finding him near the sick, his sketchbook open but his attention elsewhere. "Monsieur Cope," Poirot said, his voice deceptively mild, "your sketches, they are few, and your hands, they are too clean for an artist in this dust. And this," he held up the vial, still wrapped, "it was found among your possessions. Digitalis, Nan." Jefferson's face paled, but his voice remained steady. "That's mine, Monsieur Poirot. I have a heart condition. My doctor prescribed it." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A heart condition, monsieur. Yet you climb these cliffs with ease, and your pulse, it is steady as a metronome. Curious, Nan." Jefferson's smile faltered, his fingers twitching. "I don't know what you're implying. I was nowhere near her when she died." Poirot let the silence stretch, knowing it would unnerve. "The truth, Monsieur Cope, it has a way of surfacing, like water in this desert." Poirot returned to the camp, his mind turning over Gerard's words and the damning evidence of the vial. The psychological key was clear. Mrs. Boynton's tyranny had created a pressure that could only be released by her death. But only one with the clarity to plan and the nerve to act could have executed such a crime. Jefferson's calm exterior, his weak alibi, and now the vial pointed to him. But Poirot cautioned himself against haste. The family's secret Snadine's planned escape, Lennox's suppressed rage, Raymond and Carol's shared rebellion. Ginevra's enigmatic detachment tool suggested motives, but the method required a mind unclouded by emotion. "The spider," Poirot murmured, gazing at the cliffs. "It spins carefully, but its web is fragile." The day was young, and the truth was closer, waiting for Poirot's final move to bring it into the light. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The sun hung low over Petra, bathing the camp in a golden haze that belied the tension simmering beneath its surface. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of the camp, his posture erect, his eyes gleaming with the quiet confidence of a man who sensed the endgame approaching. The death of Mrs. Boynton, with its telltale puncture mark and missing syringe, had woven a web of suspicion around her family, but the threads now converged on Jefferson Cope, the vial of digitalis, his faltering alibi, and the Bedouin boys. Testimony formed a constellation of evidence, yet Poirot knew that to catch a killer required more than clues. It required a trap. Tonight he would spring it, in the manner of Hercule Poirot, with precision and flair. The camp was restless. The travellers gathered under the canvas awning for dinner, their conversations muted by the shadow of death. The Boyntons sat apart, their faces a gallery of suppressed emotions. Lennox's apathy, Nadine's guarded resolve, Raymond's nervous glances, Carol's taut defiance, and Ginevra's dreamy detachment. Jefferson Cope, seated at the edge, maintained his polished smile, but Poirot noted the slight tremor in his hands as he lifted his glass. Sarah King and Dr. Theodore Gerard sat nearby, their eyes occasionally meeting Poirot's, as if sensing his intent. Mr. Martmode, the guide, hovered anxiously, eager for the authorities' arrival, still hours away. Poirot rose, his cane tapping softly on the ground, and addressed the group, his voice clear and commanding. "Madame et messieurs," he said, "the tragedy of Madame Boynton's death weighs heavily on us all. But I, Hercule Poirot, have seen many such tragedies, and I tell you now this was no accident. It was murder, planned with care, and the killer is among us." A gasp rippled through the group, the Boyntons stiffening, their eyes darting. Jefferson's smile froze, his fork pausing mid-air. Poirot continued, his tone measured. "The truth, it is like the stones of Petra. It endures, and it will be revealed." He paced slowly, his gaze sweeping the group. "Let us consider the facts. Madame Boynton was alive at 1 o'clock, seen by Monsieur Marmot. By 3 o'clock, she was dead, a puncture mark on her wrist suggesting a fatal injection digitalis. Perhaps, as Monsieur le Docteur Gerard has indicated, a syringe is missing from his kit, and a vial of digitalis was found, hidden carefully." Poirot paused, letting the words settle, his eyes locking on Jefferson. "Monsieur Cope, you claim you were sketching from 12:30 to 2:30. Oui. Yet a Bedouin boy saw you near Madame Boynton's chair at 1:15, carrying your leather case. Mademoiselle King confirms this. And then there is the vial found in your tent." Jefferson's face paled, but he rallied, his voice smooth. "You're mistaken, Monsieur Poirot. I was sketching, as I said. The vial is for my heart condition. I wasn't near her at 1:15. Poirot raised a hand, his smile enigmatic. "And yet, monsieur, there is more. A witness saw you dispose of a syringe in a crevice near the sick, shortly after the fatal hour. This was a bluff, a calculated thrust, but Poirot's tone carried the weight of certainty." Jefferson's composure cracked, his eyes widening. "That's impossible," he snapped. "No one could have seen there was no crevice." He stopped, realizing his mistake, his hand gripping the table. Poirot pounced, his voice like a whip. "No crevice, you say? Yet you know the syringe was disposed of, a detail I did not share. You gave Madame Boynton water at noon, returned at 1:15 to inject the digitalis, and hid the syringe, believing the desert heat would mask your crime as a heart attack. But the little grey cells, they see what you did not." The camp was silent, all eyes on Jefferson, whose face now betrayed panic. "You planned to free the family from her tyranny," Poirot continued, "but also to secure their inheritance. Nan, as stepson, you gained little unless the others were implicated." Jefferson stood, his chair scraping the ground. "You can't prove this," he shouted, but his voice trembled. "I cared for her. I wouldn't." Poirot cut him off, his tone relentless. "You cared for your own future, monsieur. The vial, the boy's testimony, your own words, they betray you." Jefferson sank back, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining from him. The Boyntons stared, their expressions a mix of shock and dawning relief. Sarah King's hand covered her mouth, while Dr. Gerard nodded grimly, as if confirming his own suspicions. Poirot turned to the group, his voice softening. "The trap, it is sprung. Monsieur Cope, your crime is laid bare. The authorities, when they arrive, will hear all." Jefferson's eyes darted, seeking escape, but the camp's isolation offered none. He slumped further, his silence a confession. Poirot stepped back, his work done for now, though his heart was heavy. Murder, even of a tyrant, was a stain on the soul, and he felt its weight. As the group dispersed, the Boyntons remained seated, their faces reflecting a fragile freedom. Poirot caught Sarah's eye, her nod one of gratitude and awe. Dr. Gerard approached, his voice low. A masterstroke, Monsieur Poirot. You saw the mind behind the act. Poirot's moustache twitched. The mind, Monsieur le Docteur, always betrays itself. The night closed in, the cliffs of Petra standing sentinel over a truth now exposed, and Poirot knew the final act was near. Chapter 10. The motive unveiled. The desert night hung heavy over Petra, the stars casting a cold light on the camp where the air thrummed with the aftershock of Hercule Poirot's revelation. The travellers, their dinner abandoned, had dispersed to their tents, leaving the Boynton family and Jefferson Cope under the canvas awning, the weight of truth settling like dust. Poirot stood apart, his cane planted in the sand, his eyes fixed on Jefferson, whose polished façade had crumbled into a mask of defeat. The trap had been sprung, and now, Poirot knew, the full confession would follow, for a cornered mind seeks relief in admission. The little grey cells, ever vigilant, awaited the final piece of the puzzle, the motive that had driven a man to murder. Jefferson sat slumped, his hands clasped tightly, his sketchbook discarded on the table. The Boyntons watched him, their expressions a kaleidoscope of shock, betrayal, and a strange, tentative relief. Lennox's gaunt face held a flicker of surprise, as if he could not fathom action after years of inertia. Nadine's eyes, sharp and assessing, betrayed no warmth for her stepbrother. Raymond and Carol, clutching each other's hands, seemed to draw strength from their shared ordeal, while Ginevra, her gaze less vacant now, stared at Jefferson as if seeing him for the first time. Sarah King and Dr. Theodore Gerard lingered. Nearby, their presence a quiet support for Poirot's unfolding drama. Poirot stepped forward, his voice calm but unrelenting. "Monsieur Cope," he said, "the evidence is clear. The vial of digitalis, your presence at 1:15, the missing syringe, your slip about the crevice. You killed Madame Boynton, oui. But why? Speak, for the truth, it will not be denied." Jefferson's head lifted, his eyes meeting Poirot's with a mix of defiance and resignation. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. Then, like a dam bursting, he spoke. "She deserved it," Jefferson said, his voice low, venomous. "You don't know what she was, Monsieur Poirot, a monster, not a mother. She crushed us Lennox, Raymond, Carol, even Ginevra. She dangled her fortune like a noose, controlling every breath we took. I was her stepson, but I got nothing unless they were all disinherited. She taunted me with it, said I'd never be free unless I bowed to her." His hands clenched, his composure gone. "I couldn't live like that anymore. None of us could." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his moustache twitching. "And so, you planned, Nan. The digitalis, stolen from Monsieur le Docteur Gerard's kit. The syringe, hidden after the deed. You saw your chance in Petra's isolation." Jefferson nodded, his voice hoarse. "I took the syringe, days ago, in Jerusalem. I knew her heart was weak. Digitalis would look like a natural death, especially in this heat. At noon, I gave her water, made sure she was alone. At 1:15, I came back, injected her while she dozed. She didn't even stir. I hid the syringe in a crevice, thinking no one would look." He laughed bitterly. "I thought I'd freed us all, and maybe I'd get a share of the estate if they suspected each other. The Boyntons gasped, their faces reflecting the sting of betrayal. Nadine's voice cut through, sharp and cold. You used us, Jefferson. You wanted her money, not our freedom. Raymond's eyes blazed. You let us live in her shadow, knowing you could end it. Carol's hand tightened on his, her voice trembling. You're no better than she was, Ginevra, silent until now. Whispered, the spirits knew. They always knew. Poirot noted her words, sensing a clarity beneath her strangeness, but his focus remained on Jefferson. You miscalculated, Monsieur Poirot said, his tone measured. The puncture mark. It was your error. And the boy, the Bedouin, he saw you. Mademoiselle King saw you. The little grey cells, they saw through your mask. Jefferson's shoulders sagged, his defiance spent. I thought I was clever, he muttered. I thought I'd outsmarted her at last. Poirot shook his head, his voice tinged with sorrow. Murder, Monsieur Cope. It is never clever. It is a stain that cannot be washed away. Poirot signalled to Mr. Mahmoud, who had been listening, wide-eyed. Keep Monsieur Cope under watch. Until the authorities arrive, he must face justice. Mahmoud nodded, summoning two Bedouin servants to stand guard. Jefferson rose, his movements mechanical, and allowed himself to be led to his tent, his head bowed. The Boyntons remained, their silence heavy with the weight of their new reality. Sarah King approached Poirot, her voice soft. You saw it all, didn't you? The truth, hidden in plain sight. Poirot's eyes twinkled, though his expression was grave. The truth, mademoiselle, it is like the stars it shines, even in the darkest night. Dr. Gerard joined them, his notebook tucked away. A remarkable mind, Monsieur Poirot. You saw the man behind the act, the greed behind the duty. Poirot inclined his head. The mind, Monsieur le Docteur, it betrays itself in the smallest details. As the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, Poirot gazed at the cliffs, their rose-red hues now cloaked in shadow. The motive was unveiled, the killer unmasked, but the cost of freedom was a burden the Boyntons would carry forever. Poirot's work was nearly done, but the echoes of this tragedy would linger, a reminder that even in victory, justice was bittersweet. Chapter 11. The family free. The dawn broke over Petra with a quiet radiance, the cliffs glowing softly as if cleansed by the revelation of truth. Hercule Poirot stood at the camp's edge, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes tracing the ancient contours of the rose-red city. The arrest of Jefferson Cope had lifted a veil from the Boynton family, but the air still carried the weight of their long captivity. Mrs. Boynton's death, though a liberation, had left scars, and Poirot knew that freedom, so dearly bought, would demand its own reckoning. The authorities were due to arrive by midday, and with them, Jefferson would face justice. But for now, the camp held its breath, poised between past and future. The Boyntons gathered near their tents, their faces reflecting a fragile new reality. Lennox, his gaunt frame less hunched, sat beside Nadine, their hands touching for the first time in Poirot's memory. Raymond and Carol stood close, their shared ordeal forging a bond that now seemed unbreakable. Ginevra, her sketchbook reclaimed, sat cross-legged, her pencil moving with a purpose Poirot had not seen before. The absence of their mother's shadow was palpable, yet their eyes held a mix of relief and uncertainty, as if they were stepping into a world they scarcely knew. Poirot approached, his manner gentle but observant. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "you have endured a great trial. The chains of Madame Boynton are broken, but the heart, it must heal, Nan." Nadine looked up, her auburn hair catching the morning light. her voice steady but soft. "We're free, Monsieur Poirot, but it feels strange. I stayed for Lennox, but now we can start again." Lennox nodded, a spark of life in his eyes. "She took everything, my will, my hope. Now I have to find them again." Poirot inclined his head, noting the tentative strength in their words. The first steps toward renewal. Raymond and Carol joined them, their faces brighter but still guarded. "We owe you, Monsieur Poirot," Raymond said, his voice firm. "You saw what we couldn't, that Jefferson was using us, playing on our pain." Carol's eyes were fierce. "He thought we'd be blamed, didn't he? But we're stronger than that." Poirot smiled faintly. "Strength, mademoiselle, it grows in the darkest places. You and your brother, you have it in abundance." Raymond glanced at Sarah King, who stood nearby, her presence a quiet anchor. "And maybe now," he said, "I can choose my own path." Poirot's mustache twitched. Sensing the unspoken promise between Raymond and Sarah, Ginevra looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes clearer than before. "The spirits are quiet now," she said, her voice almost steady. "She's gone, and they don't need to whisper anymore." Poirot studied her, wondering how much of her strangeness had been a shield against her mother's tyranny. "Mademoiselle Ginevra," he said, "you will protect your gift. The world, it needs your vision." She nodded, a small smile breaking through, and Poirot saw a mind beginning to mend. Sarah King approached, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, her expression a mix of gratitude and resolve. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "you've given them a chance at life again. And Raymond, he's different now, freer." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Love, mademoiselle, it is a great liberator, Nan. You will guide him well." Sarah blushed, but her nod was firm, a silent vow to stand by Raymond's side. Dr. Theodore Gerard joined them, his notebook tucked away, his spectacles glinting in the sun. "You are a marvel, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "You saw not just the clues, but the souls behind them. The Boyntons were prisoners, and you unlocked their cage." Poirot bowed slightly. "The soul, Monsieur le Docteur, it leaves footprints, even in the desert. I merely followed them." Gerard's smile was warm. "And what footprints you leave, Monsieur, path to justice." As the morning progressed, the camp stirred with the arrival of the authorities, their dusty jeeps rumbling into the valley. Jefferson Cope, under guard, was led from his tent, his face haggard, his defiance gone. He glanced at the Boyntons, but said nothing, his silence an admission of defeat. The authorities took his statement, guided by Poirot's meticulous account of the evidence, the vial, the boy's testimony, Sarah's sighting, and Jefferson's own slip about the crevice. As they prepared to take him away, Poirot watched, his heart heavy with the cost of truth. The Boyntons, now unbound, began to pack their belongings, their movements tentative but purposeful. Lennox and Nadine spoke of returning to America, of rebuilding a life together. Raymond and Sarah walked hand in hand toward the sick, their laughter a faint echo of hope. Carol took Ginevra's hand, vowing to protect her sister's fragile spirit. Poirot watched them go, his mind at peace, but his soul touched by the tragedy of a family so long enslaved. "Freedom," he murmured, "it is a gift, but it comes with shadows." The cliffs of Petra stood silent, their secrets safe, as the Boyntons stepped into a future unshackled by the past. Chapter 12. The Return to Jerusalem. The sun blazed high over the desert, as Hercule Poirot boarded the dusty bus that would carry the tour group back to Jerusalem, its engine rumbling like a weary beast. The rose-red cliffs of Petra receded into the distance, their ancient secrets now joined by the tragedy of Mrs. Boynton's murder and Jefferson Cope's unmasking. Poirot sat near the front, his straw hat resting on his lap, his eyes half closed but his mind as sharp as ever. The Boynton family, scattered across the bus, bore the marks of their newfound freedom, fragile yet real. The little grey cells, though satisfied with the resolution of the case, were already stirring. For Poirot knew that one mystery's end often heralded another's beginning. The journey was quieter than the outbound trip, the travellers subdued by the weight of recent events. Lennox and Nadine sat together, their hands entwined, their faces softened by a cautious hope. Raymond and Sarah King shared a seat, their conversation low and intimate, a budding connection that promised to outlast. The dessert. Carol sat with Ginevra, her protective gaze fixed on her younger sister, who clutched her sketchbook, her pencil moving with a newfound steadiness. Jefferson Cope, under the watchful eye of a local official, sat alone at the back, his once polished demeanour replaced by a hollow resignation. Poirot noted their positions, their expressions, storing each detail in the orderly chambers of his mind. As the bus wound through the arid hills, Poirot sipped water from a flask, his thoughts drifting to the case's conclusion. Jefferson's confession had laid bare a motive rooted in greed and desperation, a calculated bid to sever the chains of Mrs. Boynton's tyranny while securing a share of her wealth. The vial of digitalis, the stolen syringe, the Bedouin boy's testimony, and Sarah's keen observation had formed a net from which he could not escape. Yet Poirot felt no triumph, only a quiet sorrow for a family so warped by control that murder had seemed a path to freedom. "The human heart," he murmured, "it is a labyrinth, even to Hercule Poirot." In Jerusalem, the group disembarked at their hotel, the city's bustle a stark contrast to Petra's stillness. The Boyntons, now unshackled, prepared to part ways, their plans tentative but resolute. Lennox and Nadine spoke of a quiet life, perhaps in a small town where they could rebuild without the shadow of wealth. Raymond, emboldened by Sarah's presence, planned to study abroad, his eyes alight with dreams once stifled. Carol, ever the protector, vowed to care for Ginevra, whose fragile mind showed signs of mending through her art. Poirot watched them from the hotel terrace, his heart warmed by their resilience, though he knew their scars would linger. Dr. Theodore Gerard joined him, his notebook now closed, his spectacles glinting in the afternoon light. "You have done a great thing, Monsieur Poirot," he said. "You freed them not just from a murderer, but from a past that bound them." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Freedom, Monsieur le Docteur, it is a gift that must be earned anew each day. They have begun, and that is enough." Gerard nodded, his smile one of respect. "And you, monsieur, what next for the great detective?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "The little grey cells, they never rest. There is always another puzzle, Nan." As evening fell, Poirot retired to his room, his suitcase neatly packed for his next destination. He sat at a small desk, sipping a tisane, when a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. A hotel porter slipped a letter under the door, its envelope unmarked but sealed with wax. Poirot opened it, his brow furrowing as he read the cryptic message. "The game continues, Monsieur Poirot. Seek the truth in Damascus." No signature, no clue to its sender, yet the words stirred a familiar thrill. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, his fingers brushing his moustache. "The world, it is never short of mysteries." He rose, gazing out at Jerusalem's ancient walls, their stones aglow under the moon. The Boyntons were free, Jefferson would face justice, and Petra's secrets were laid bare. Yet the letter promised a new challenge, a fresh canvas for his little grey cells. Poirot smiled, his heart light despite the weight of justice. "Hercule Poirot," he said softly, "you are never truly on holiday, are you?" With a twinkle in his eye, he began to plan his journey to Damascus, where another truth awaited, hidden in the shadows of another ancient city.